Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's installment of our free webinar series, Maximizing Data Quality for Value and ROI. My name is Kevin Esky. I'm Director of Sales here at TechExtend, and today's session will be around CA ERwin Complete Compare, Overview and Best Practices. Today's agenda will include a brief description on who TechExtend is, followed by the CA ERwin Complete Compare webinar hosted by Victor Rodriguez, the data management and data warehousing consultant here at TechExtend. We'll follow Victor's presentation with a questions and answers period and then a summary. TechExtend is a leading e-seller of developer and infrastructure tools. We can be found on the web at www.techextend.com. CA ERwin falls under our database worldview ecosystem. We are an elite CA partner and the #1 data modeling reseller for CA in North America. We also have an on-staff CA sales and engineering team, focusing on database modeling and infrastructure, design and training services. We are also the leader in delivery of CA education and an authorized VET and VSA partner. Under our database worldview, we provide industry-leading tools for your end-to-end development needs, including defining, designing, developing, testing, deploying, and managing. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar and find it to be very informative, as always, with Victor. And without further ado, I will now turn things over to Victor. Victor?
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everybody, for joining again. Today's topic is the Complete Compare, ERwin Complete Compare. Many of you may still be using ERwin 7. Just to let you know right off the top of the presentation that pretty much all the strategies and techniques we'll be looking at today will be equally valid for your 7 deployment. And of course, all our demos will be in 8. There'll be tiny little differences, but most of the best practices, most of what you're going to see, and pretty much the editors in general are going to look exactly the same in your current implementation. So without further ado, let's get going with the presentation. And there we go. All right, so the agenda for today, we'll be looking at what is Complete Compare, kind of an overview of what the functionality is in the software itself. A walkthrough of the editors. Any of you who've used the ERwin before, you've probably had questions as to exactly what you're seeing in particular different dialogues. I'll explain that to you during our demonstration. Then some best practices that I always suggest whenever I have consultations or whenever I consult with the users and they ask me questions. As far as like what I think are some just real basic strategies that are really going to simplify the way your process is. And then we're going to do some demonstrations. So I'll show you some of these in practice and show you how you can get a pretty quick and clean result set pretty quickly by just using some kind of really basic strategies. We'll be looking at migrating between a logical and physical design. I might change this up a little bit based on just kind of some of the feedback I've had from users to kind of hone in on what they're asking. And we'll see that when we jump into the demos, I'll walk you through everything. So even if the agenda is a little different, don't worry about it. I'll walk you through what we're going to be doing. And then we could also look at generating reports, which is a good thing that I saw that on that bullet point because I definitely want to talk about it. And then Q&A at the end. So please feel free to ask your questions in the dialog box, and we will answer them in the QA box there to your right, and we'll answer them at the end of the demonstration and the presentation. All right, so what is the Complete Compare tool? The editor itself, this is a common interface that you're going to see across many different functionalities in the tool. So real basically, compare between a model, model to model, model to database, database to database, logical to physical design. It's any kind of compare of anything that can be modeled, basically. So that's probably the way most people have interacted with that, even going back all the way back to 4.1.4 or even earlier when they first rolled out the Complete Compare tool. But if you do a sync with model source, now this is something that's kind of a little more advanced, that was introduced in ERwin 7, the idea of having a model sources. So you can actually take, let's say we have a larger design and we want to derive a model based on just one subject area, or we have a logical design and we want to generate a physical design from it. So you had the ability of having multiple models derived from individual sources or multiple sources. There is a sync with model source tool, and of course this uses the same interface. So if you learn how to do a Complete Compare, you're pretty much ready to use the sync with model source tool as well. Repository model merge. So if you've ever used the model manager, now it's called the Enterprise Edition or repository, whatever you want to call it. If you've used the repository, the model repository, you've probably checked out a diagram at some point. You worked with it offline. you have a user who's made similar changes that maybe conflict with your current changes into the repository stored model. And then when you go to actually save your models back in, you would be presented with this resolve differences screen. Once again, same interface that you're going to see across the board with the Complete Compare. So new in 8.2, 8.2 is just a couple weeks away. There's going to be a launch, so contact us if you're curious, or just follow me on LinkedIn or any of the social media channels, and you'll get an announcement for the launch for the 8.2 software. A lot of new functionality in 8.2. Specific to Complete Compare, there is automated template synchronization with the repository models. So what that means is that in the past, hopefully, you've been doing this as a best practice, and it's definitely one of the key best practices for the modeling tool in general, is to create a template. So if I have domains I use all the time, subject areas I use all the time, design elements I use all the time, maybe the way I like my trigger bodies to be defined, or the fonts and colors I like to use, that are my preferences. If you're doing that over and over and over again, also option sets, maybe Complete Compare, forward engineer, reverse engineer option sets that you're using regularly, you should actually be storing them into template files, saving them into the repository if you do have the repository. It becomes a very convenient way of actually generating new models based on your existing standards. So really powerful thing to do. There's automated template synchronization in this new release. And what that means is that if you've derived models based on a template as you go forward, that you can actually update the template file, and then those changes, maybe domain changes, maybe new naming standards, will propagate throughout all the attached models. If you select to, you don't have to, but it's an option. But when you actually do go to synchronize with your templates, you'll be presented once again with the exact same resolve differences screen. So the main takeaway of me bringing this all up is that learning this compare functionality, because it's used in so many places in the tool, really is going to make modeling better in general, or your modeling practice better in general. So I actually have all these slides for the compare editor itself, but rather than doing all that, I actually decided I'm going to just show you this in ERwin so I can actually walk through it with you. And here we go. So what I want to show you here is the actual editor itself. So if you haven't used this before, the Complete Compare is available from under Actions, Complete Compare. I think if you're using ERwin 7, it's under Tools, Complete Compare. So it moved a little bit, but either under Tools or Actions, depending on what version of ERwin you're using. And this is ERwin 8.2, a preview version of it, but it's exactly the same in ERwin, the 8 versions. Under Actions, Complete Compare. And in this first dialog box, what I want to point out is that you actually are going to jump. There's multiple tabs here for the editing here on the left, and we actually automatically open to this right model. You can actually step backwards and look at the other tabs, but basically what this means, the Overview tab just kind of gives you a definition of what Complete Compare is. The Left Model tab allows you to populate any model to the left in the Complete Compare dialog. Doesn't matter which option you decide to. But the reason you jump directly to this right model selection is because the default setting is that your left model is going to be the currently open model. So we jump immediately to the right model. You can have many different models open. If you have 10, 15, 20 different models open here, in this case you see one of my models is actually open from my Model Manager repository. See the location actually reads Model Mart and then the library path. But this other file is actually open from a specific file path. So regardless of where this file comes from, you're actually going to see it in this dialog box here. So that's the first part of this. Any open models are listed here. If you want to open additional models, you can open them from, select them to load them from a file from the Model Mart by clicking over here, or from a database. And we're going to do this during the demo, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to let you know that you can load to the right model any other file, a MART, or directly connect to a database. Type selection. Now this is the most powerful feature, and it's really probably the most underused and maybe the most problematic usage of the tool comes from this particular option set here. The type selection allows users to specify what level of compare and then what actual objects are going to be compared. So what actually happens here is that we have a logical level compare, physical level compare. This is a combined logical physical model, so I actually can do either one or both sides of the design model at the same time. Excuse me. And also a database level compare. Now, the database level compare is a filter down option set relating to basically just the objects that are going to create schema objects. So I often have a question where people will ask me, well, what's the difference between the database level compare and the actual physical level compare? And the difference is, think about what the physical model represents. In the ERwin model, the physical model has not only my schema definitions, my physical storage parameters, my tables and objects like that, my domains, things like that, but I also include things that aren't really necessarily database level objects. For example, the fonts on those objects, the coordinates of the actual graphical objects, the subject areas that have separated out these different tables into different areas. That's stuff that doesn't matter from the point of view of the database, because the database is simply concerned with what are the objects that are going to actually generate SQL, or going to actually generate schema for me. So that's a key differentiator there. And this kind of starts to speak to a point I want to hopefully drive home over the course of this webinar, which is that by creating an option set that is specific to what you're trying to achieve, you will get a much better result. So the key really here is, if you're looking at logical objects, you should look at a logical compare physical database. But not only that, what objects am I really concerned about at the object level itself? Like maybe I want to know my table comments and the owner and physical name, and maybe the stored procedures as well. But I don't care about the column order. I don't care about dimensional notation. Maybe I do care about my column properties related to, well, once again, my comment, my physical name, and the data type. But a lot of these other things, like the parent attribute, for example, may not matter to me. My check constraint usage, I might be concerned with the actual rule, but maybe my names are different. Maybe I have some kind of naming standards in my model, but not in my database. So these are things that are going to appear as differences over and over and over again. So by remembering to filter them out here, we can get a much cleaner result set. And that's going to be the demo I'm going to show you in just a minute. But to complete this kind of introduction to the editors, once I've actually created this filtered down option set, now this is another key point that users always forget to think about, is that we have the ability of saving this. So remember, you can save this option set either into the existing model, either one of the models that are loaded. Oh, I apologize for that. Clicked on the wrong button. But you can actually save it into either one of the open models, either to the left or right model, and then give it a custom name here, where I can just call this like filtered. And that would actually save it into my left model as filtered, but I can also save it as an XML file. So think about being able to actually save this to a physical location, and I have some here that I've created previously, but you actually have the ability of creating an option set that maybe is going to give you what you're looking for to accomplish, and then saving it for reuse in the future. Not only can you reuse it, but your other users can reuse it. So if you said, this is the best option set, I always use this one, it gives me really clean results whenever I'm trying to merge my database changes into my model, this is the one that I use, it gives me really good results. Then save it to an XML file, put it on a shared drive somewhere, and tell everybody else where it's located. Or even better yet, create a template file that contains it, and then just tell everybody, use this template file, all the option sets are in there already. It's a very powerful thing to do, and definitely one of the best practices that I'm going to kind of introducing at this point. So next set of options here, you can actually navigate to them individually here, or you can actually just continue to click this next button down at the bottom. Now, by the way, you can actually click compare at any time. Like if you already have done this 100 times before and you're very comfortable and you know exactly what your results are going to look like, just jump on the compare button, especially if you're just stepping out of a complete compare and then back into it again. But I just want to kind of introduce all the features here as part of the webinar. Left object selection. So what does this give us? This actually allows us to, and let me show you a better model that gives me a better example of this. Let me just open a model that I have here, open from before. Oh, I thought I had one here for you. Let me open it from my desktop. And I'm just looking for a particular copy of this eMovies model to show you something in the Complete Compare editor here. So once again, the Complete Compare editor. We'll see now we have an additional model listed here because we have opened a new model from from that dialog. So now anything that's open currently in this session is available as a right or left model, can be loaded to either side, whatever your preference is. But let me jump back to this left object selection and show you what you actually have the ability of doing here. So now once again, type selection allows us to look at what objects are we going to be comparing on. Like what category of objects, columns, data types, tables, physical storage parameters, etc. So constraints, validation rules. So a category of objects. What category of metadata am I going to be including? But then you actually have a list of objects that are contained within that model. And there are different ways you can actually filter on it. And that's what allows us to do this left and right object selection. So for example, I can filter based on subject area. So you'll see here on the right-hand side, these are all the available objects. I can actually go in here and specify with checkboxes which one of these objects I actually want to include. But I can actually use these automated filters here. If I go and I select the accounting subject area, for example, from the subject area list, and I re-expand this entities, you'll see that some of these are automatically unselected. So if you've done the work of actually breaking up your design into multiple subject areas, use that as part of your filtering. Occasionally, you do need to make changes that you need to roll out to all 500 tables in a particular giant design, but the reality is most of the time we're looking at a very small subset of models, objects that we actually have some kind of separation on. They're either owned by a particular schema owner, and let me show you that as well. I can actually do a filter here based on a particular schema owner. So in this case, I think everything's owned by DBO in this example, but I'll show you a better example when we actually go into the demos. What you actually do is you can actually see that the entities will be separated based on who owns that particular schema. So you may have different ways where you're separating your design, whether they're subject areas, whether they're schema owners, and you want to be able to use that to facilitate this compare process. Other things you can filter on, you can either include or exclude triggers, which is pretty straightforward. You can specify who owns objects. You can create an owner list, separate them by commas, and then you can actually include like 2 or 3 owners that you want to create a filter on. That works as well. And lastly, you can actually include or exclude index objects. So for example, maybe I do care about my primary keys and alternate keys, but maybe I don't generate foreign keys, not using constraints. Maybe I don't use indexes, I should say. I use constraints instead. Maybe I want to just globally ignore them. I can do that here as well. So that's the level of options I can use to filter objects. And I could do the same thing with the right object selection. So here we are in the right object. You see we have very similar filters available here as well, or identical filters actually available. So these are available on both sides of your design. And then lastly, I'm going to go into these very, very quickly. And this is another key best practice takeaway I hope everybody takes from this. If you get to this dialog box and you are not sure or you don't remember what I say right now, remember that in ERwin, where any dialog you're in, you can hit the F1, the function 1 key, and it will actually open your help menu specific to, and you see I've just done it now, it actually opens select advanced options to refine the compare criteria. So this actually gives you a definition of what all these options are, and it's specific to the dialog box that's currently open. So remember that you can always hit F1 at any time, and then that will give you an explanation as to, like, you might be wondering, well, what does this checkbox do? What does that exactly mean? I'm not sure exactly what that is, and it will give you definition there. But quickly to explain what this is. The topmost auto-dispose database script models, what that means is that if you're building a model based on a reverse engineer and you're doing this live within the Complete Compare, which is going to be one of the exercises we're going to do in a moment, that you can actually dispose of that model immediately. So it's not saved after the fact. This really depends on whether you want to do this or not. If you're going to do a partial reverse engineer, something that's not really going to be useful in the future, you want to use this auto-dispose. If you're going to do a full reverse engineer of the entire system and build a model from it, you may actually want to preserve that model. So that's not necessarily a bad thing to do, but it's really up to what your choices are as far as doing your compare. Auto-resolving missing UDPs. So what does that mean? That means that you've probably noticed in the past, if you have used user-defined properties, user-defined properties are a functionality in ERwin where you can create metadata that may not be captured by the tool itself. You can just define your own metadata and create your own tags on your objects. Now this auto-resolve UDPs, if you don't resolve them, they'll always show as differences, right? My database model doesn't have the UDPs that exist in my design model. That just makes perfect sense. But if I turn this checkbox on, it will just bring in those properties automatically, so I don't see them as hundreds and hundreds of differences that I'm going to have to manually resolve anyway at the end. So you can just automatically resolve them here. Case-sensitive compare, that's pretty straightforward, right? If you have lowercase names in your design, uppercase in your database, if you don't want to show them all as differences, which is the default, so they will synchronize, right? Customer with camel case will match with uppercase customer in your database. But if I turn this on, they would actually show as two different objects. Display unified attributes. This means that you can choose whether you want ERwin to show columns that unify in a table as one column or multiple columns. So what does that mean? It means that if like the column ID is coming from 3 or 4 different tables along 3 or 4 different constraints, they're actually unifying into one column in the target table. So what you can actually do there is you can actually choose to say, okay, this is going to be one column, which is the way it appears in MySQL, or it's going to show it multiple columns, because the reality is that those multiple columns represent multiple parent objects. So you can choose which way you want to look at them. The next option here is exclude unaligned objects on left and right. Those are the next two. I'm going to kind of just group them together for obvious reasons. And I'm going to tell you that as a best practice, I never use these. The reason I never use them is that in the Resolve Differences screen, which is the final dialog box in this Complete Compare, you have the ability of doing the exact same filtering. So I prefer to bring it all in there and filter after the fact. If you filter beforehand, it just limits my possibilities when I get to the Resolve Differences screen. So I never use that. Ignore code comments. I always leave that turned on. Just to explain what that means, let's say you have stored procedures. The bodies of the stored procedures are identical, but there's a comment that says, created by Victor on November 15th, and the other one says created by Joe on, January 5th. But otherwise, the logic of the code is the same. If I ignore the code comments, they'll appear as equal rather than showing me that, well, this is exactly the same except that it has a different comment on it, which I really don't care about most of the time. So leave that checked on by default. Another best practice, include only generated objects. So let's say, for example, you might have a table that's part of your logical design. It's a placeholder for zip code information, but you don't actually have a different physical table for it. It really just exists in this, address table you have out there. But you actually keep that table there as part of your design, and you turn the generate option off just so you can show it to your developers, or, so it shows your logic there. But you're not actually going to, at any time, generate code for that table. So you turn the generate option off. If you don't exclude the generated objects, what you'll see is you're going to see it in the Complete Compare, and there's no way to resolve it. So this is another frustration people have. So by just simply remembering to keep that selected, include only generated objects, you're going to remove those objects that cannot be generated from that, just more junk that you're seeing in that Resolve Differences screen. Prefix owner. That's a good standard by default. I like to have that turned on. Simply shows the table with the owner name prefixed in case it just gives some clarification sometimes when objects misalign and you're not sure why. Select active subject area. By default, you're going to be able to filter on the subject area, so I don't select that option by default. But basically what it means is that whatever subject area is currently open, that is my object filter. So if that's useful to you, just make sure that you remember that it's there. Using database ID matching and then using name matching. These are two different things that are both turned on, and they kind of conflict with each other sometimes. So what does that mean? The database ID matching means that, let's say, for example, that I have at some point reverse engineered an actual physical database. That database has a unique identifier that the server assigns to it. So when I bring that into my database, if I then rename customer table to CUST for some naming compliance issue, the unique identifiers are still the same. So if I have that option turned on, when I do a Complete Compare, the objects will align with each other. Using name matching is the opposite. When I do name matching, CUST and customer would not align with each other. So like I said, these would sometimes conflict with each other, but depending on what your environment is, you will want to have one or the other. By default, I believe the database ID overrides the name matching, but if you have them both turned on, it will try to align based on one or the other. But sometimes they will conflict. Like I mentioned before, you might have a new customer table, which is not the CUST table anymore, and those two things may misalign, but you actually want them to be lined up, so that could be a little confusing. But I just want to kind of tell you that both tools are available. It really depends on how you design for you to know which one is best for you. Let me jump back into the slides for a moment, and then we're going to come back right again to actually do these demos. And let me go back. Here we go. So some best practices. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to mention, I'll show you this during the demo itself, is that always use descriptive model names when in the actual model properties, and I'll show you how to do that. And you'll see how it pays dividends on so many places when you're running reports, when you're saving to your model manager. There's so many different places that it pays dividends, but the main, or maybe the main usage for it, where it's really useful, is it adds a lot of clarification when you're actually doing complete compare. Like I mentioned before, briefly, create custom compare options sets for different activities rather than one size fits all. I have users ask me oftentimes, well, what option set do you suggest for me to do these 15 things? And my answer to that really, in most basic terms, is I don't recommend one option set to do all 15 things. If you want to bring in your logical definitions, create an option set that includes the logical names, the definitions for those objects, and maybe some logical design properties. If you want to bring in just your stored procedure definitions, then you should have an option set for those stored procedures. Simply by creating one huge option set that is going to try to look at 15 different levels of design logic is just going to give you a messy complete compare. It's as simple as that. So most of the time we're looking at a compare is really focused on a subset of objects that we're really designing. Really create option sets to focus on what you're trying to achieve. Share these with your teams, whether you save it into a template file, like I mentioned before, or save it as a standalone XML file that anybody can access. It's not just there for the rest of your team members, it's there for you. You know, if you say, I've created an option set for my validation rules, for my default values, for my domains and data types, etc., then there's no reason to reinvent the wheel every single time. If you've done the work, save those option sets, reuse them. That's really the point of having these templates and these best practices. Synchronizing linked models or merged models in the shared repository shares this interface. So it's like I mentioned before, this is the same dialog box. So if you learn one activity, you learn them all. And if you are doing this within the context of a model manager repository, then your team will, by getting acclimated to one editor, they're going to be able to understand all those other editors in much greater detail as well. And then using the compare reports, what I'll show you in the demo, is make that part of your software development lifecycle. And I'll show you what I mean when we actually jump into this demo. So we're going to build the first filtered compare. That's going to be the first part of this. We're going to walk through that same dialog I showed you before, but in a real-world example. Then we're going to use compare to import schema subset. We're going to generate a report from the resolve differences dialog. So this is something you can use for approval, for your data governance or something like that. And then we'll look at, if we have time, we're going to look at syncing our submodels back into a model manager repository. And I have 2 sessions live, and hopefully it'll allow me to do this on one environment, but we'll see how that goes. We may not have enough time to cover all of these, but we'll try to cover as much of this as we can. So let me jump back into the software. So let's take a look at a sample here. And this is a real-world sample with a subset of an actual design. And the first thing I wanted to point out is what I mentioned in the best practice is creating good, useful names for your models. So the way where you do that is under our model properties. You have the ability of creating a useful model name here. So you can actually say this is, the name of the design. It could be like who the designer is, the date of the design, it could be useful, multiple different useful pieces of information, but have some kind of convention. Maybe I want to move my name down into the author section here. I'll take it out of my title. But make this a useful piece of information. And the reason is that when I go into my tools, actions, complete compare, you'll see that the open model actually shows that name here. So you've probably done a complete compare before, and the model names, and I've seen this so many times, the model names are like model 1, model 2, model 3, model 4. Not very useful piece of information. Obviously, if you have some kind of naming standards for your models, that having a very good, succinct explanation as to what the model is and, using those standards, that it's going to be very easy to identify what the models are. So as soon as you open the model, you've opened the correct design. As soon as you open the model, or you're trying to select from a list, let's say you have 10 models open, you want to select the correct model from your list, you have the ability of quickly identifying it from the screen here. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to load a file. In this case, it's a file. And this is a model that actually came in the same design from a database. And you see this has a model _4. And the reason it has a generic name, which I just told you not to use, is because this model was actually built from a reverse engineer. So, once the model was built, you should actually, give it a usable name. But of course, if you've actually built this on the fly from an actual reverse engineer at that moment, it would look exactly like this. It would have a generic name. But what's useful about the icons here anyway, there's still more useful information. And one is that if you've designed the model as a design, you've built it from scratch, it's not from a database reverse engineer, it has this icon here, which might be hard to see on the screen share here, but it basically looks like a yellow folder with some linked entities. As opposed to this model 4, the one that I just opened right now, which was actually built from an actual reverse engineer, and it actually has this like cylinder, like a blue cylinder that kind of has like that, the generic icon for like a database. So this is built from a database. So the icons themselves will look differently. So if you have a design model open and you've built some model from reverse engineer and you're like, well, which one is which? Simply by looking at the icon, you can identify which is which and what the source of that model is. And it doesn't change. So this was a model that I actually saved at one point, but it still remembers that it was actually built from a reverse engineer. So what we'll do now is we're going to go into the type selection. And this is really where the, actually, let me take one step back. I want to make sure that I have not selected the same model, and I have selected the same model for both sides. So my left model and my right model, just want to make sure we see the highlighted table, the highlighted item. I want to make sure that they're unique, and they are. So then we go to type selection. And in my type selection window, in this particular case, I'll show you what the results look like immediately. So when we click a compare here, before we do any kind of filtering, there are many, many different differences here. So we see them, see all these table differences all the way down the list. There's just many, many different list changes. There's all these validation rules, which I have in my design, but I have not implemented these actual validation rules in my database. So we just see all these missing differences between my design. So this is what we were trying to avoid, basically. So it turns out, when we looked at the design itself, that really what this modeler was trying to achieve was simply getting like their data types, the physical properties. Really, it was a database level compare at the most basic level, the definitions on their objects, things like that. So this is the first thing I would suggest whenever you're doing complete compare is rather than starting with a superset of every single object in your diagram, really do the opposite. Start with nothing at all and then build up. You can always add something. If you get to the resolve differences screen and you said, oh, I forgot validation rules, you can easily just go and add those validation rules at the 11th hour. So it's easier to start with little than to start with too much. So at the table level, I'm going to go to my properties here. And I'm going to include like comments. I'm going to include the physical name, of course. And that's pretty much all I'm going to include at the table level. At the column level, I'm going to include my physical data type, physical name, of course. The null option is something else that I need. Comments as well. And for now, I think this is pretty much all I'm going to include here. And I'm just going to show you what we see when we actually go to a compare. If I jump to the compare at this point, we're seeing a somewhat simplified compare, and I'll show you what, when we scroll through it. You'll see now that this appears like even at full expansion, we're seeing just, it fits neatly on one screen. And let me just talk you through this. Since this is the first time we're seeing the resolve differences screen, let me talk you through this in some greater detail too. You'll see that there's like a flow of logic. We actually have the model level at the top. So this is, at the top level here, we have both models listed. And once again, those useful model names are useful for us to identify which model is which. We see the same icons as before, by the way, on the headings of each column here. We see the table. Each one of the tables broken out in detail down below. And if I select any one of these, down below, like wherever I see a not equals, if I select it, I can actually see down below exactly what is the property that is not equal. So in this case, it's the data type. That's a difference between my design and my database. So another, a key, a nice best practice that I like to use is that I can actually collapse everything at the topmost level, and then if I re-expand it, I get this nice little folder section. So you can imagine if I had views and stored procedures and all these different things that were differences here, it's much easier to kind of go through in one folder at a time than to, step through each one of them individually. I can actually push out all changes in either direction, either to the left or to the right, and basically when I click an arrow in either direction, I'm selecting that change to go either into my design model or out to the database. It all depends on what direction I select the arrow to synchronize the designs in either direction. And what you actually have the ability of doing here is once you have this feature here, you can actually do it, like for example, at the topmost level here, at the folders level with tables, I can do all of them at once. I'm not going to do that though because, in the real world, the scenario, you'd actually want to go down and look at what these differences are. So now I have a much simplified version of the compare, like I mentioned before, thanks to the filtering I've done. And I say, you know what, this is a big int in my database, but at the design level, I actually want it to be an integer. So I can actually export that change simply by clicking that arrow, and it disappears at the top level. That disappears from my design as well. And the reason that disappears is because I have my filters set, and here's the filters for the display. I have filters to hide those changes once they automatically get resolved. So if I want to actually see it, I can actually turn this on, and it will show these resolved differences, this little checkbox here. And that's what this filter does here, show resolved items. I'll just mouse over it so you can see the tooltips on it. I can also show the equal changes, but that's going to show a lot of stuff, so I don't necessarily want to look at that. So let's go through the rest of these changes. Here's another column change. And it's, once again, this database is, data type. I want to update that data type. Yet another one of the same. I'll leave this one for last because this one's a little more complicated. We have that one there. One more data type difference here. And now we'll notice here, this is actually from the actual design, and we'll notice that this column does not match up with the other column, but the reason is because it looks like they've misspelled it. So the CDHP abbreviation's been abbreviated CHDP. So we actually have the ability of doing, now this is the same thing you would do not only when you're doing this with a database level compare, but even when you're synchronizing your design with an existing design, maybe in the model manager or between two modelers. There's a matching tool, match to items, and you see that the column becomes highlighted, and I can actually click on the other one. It says, do you want to match these? I say yes. And now, when I look at the properties, I notice that you'll see all the other properties are not, everything else shows as matching. So, this is me selecting equals, so I see all these equal properties. But in this case, I'm looking for not equal, so what I actually see here is simply that the physical name is different. So I can actually push out that change for physical name. And now I get a nice, clean result set. So what's my next action here? I've actually gone to the process, I've resolved these differences. But in this case, this model, even though I'm opening it as a model, actually represents an actual physical database that's out there in my design. You may have noticed, probably haven't because of the busyness of the dialogue here, but this, as we've been making changes, that this write alter script schema generation has become active. This button has become active in our toolbar. And the reason it's active is because I can now generate the script to that database that I was looking at. So let's see if I actually preview the script that was generated. We'll see here's a SQL to make those changes. So for example, CDHP has been renamed, CHDP has been renamed to CDHP. I've also, now there's, I've made a lot of data type changes which are included here when I've changed my data types from to integer, for example, which is primarily what I did. But there are constraints on some of these columns, so we're going to actually alter the constraints. We're going to drop those so that we can actually create the data type, the integer, the change of the data type to integer, I should say. And then we're recreating them with all their physical storage parameters, by the way. So it's actually including that as part of the syntax. This is all customizable, by the way. We can actually, like, maybe on my indexes, I don't want to include my physical storage. And that might change my syntax. And you see that I no longer see the physical storage parameters when the constraints get recreated. So once again, this is fully customizable. You see there's a lot of options here, exactly how you want to generate your SQL syntax. It can, you can include your primary key definitions as part of your create statement or as an alter syntax. You can specify here whatever your preference is. You can use on delete and on update. This is a SQL Server, so you actually support that syntax. SQL Server 2005 model, I should say. So you can actually specify this. And once again, rather than going in here every single time and turning on these little checkboxes, this is the way I want my SQL to look, make sure you do a save as and save this option set either into the existing model or save it as an XML file. And once again, this is my forward engineer option set. I can make that reusable so I can use it again. I can use my modelers to use it again. So another best practice, definitely use these customized option sets and save them when you've made modifications to them. There's no reason to do, reinvent the wheel every single time. You're going to save yourself a lot of time simply by doing that. So at that point, I could have generated the syntax. I didn't actually generate it in this particular case, but you could have generated it. Now, the next thing I want to point out here, once again, in the exact same dialog, so I've already reconciled my models. I can actually make those changes. I can generate the SQL to the actual live database, push those changes into the live database as well, if I have permissions to. And lastly, let me turn on this show resolve differences. I actually want to, make sure everybody knows I did this. I'm going to quickly generate a report. I'm going to click this. Now, one more menu item to remember here is show report. And I can actually save this into Internet Browser if I want to publish it out to Internet somewhere. I can save it as a Word document or as an Excel spreadsheet. So let's take a look at it as an Excel spreadsheet and see what it looks like. And we see here, these are the differences. So these are the changes that have been made between my left model and right model, the design model and the database model. So now that I've actually made these changes, I can actually save this to, save this to some shared location for validation purposes to let everybody know these are the changes made on such and such a date, and those are the design changes. So generating reports from this complete compare, another really useful way of collaborating once you've actually made these design changes. The one last thing I want to mention while we're still in this dialogue, and then we'll go into our next demo, is that you can undo all of this. So remember, ERwin has incremental, infinite undos and redos. This exists within the context of one session. So if I've made these changes, or I just was kind of testing the waters, these are the changes I would have made. If I change my mind, I'm like, you know what, I'm actually not going to roll this out into the database, but maybe I'm going to make one or two of these changes. I can actually step backwards, and you'll see as I step back that basically all the changes that I have pushed out are now back again, and I can actually step forward, and they'll all disappear once again. So you can travel back and forward in time depending on, in this case, these are some pretty rudimentary changes that are being made, but you can imagine that, for example, maybe you've decided to change a data type and a particular domain, and you actually roll out that change, and then once you see that, you actually see the impact analysis. By making that change, you see it live on the right-hand side of the model that, wait a second, there's all these other tables I wasn't thinking about that are going to have all this impact. All of a sudden, they show as differences now in my resolve differences screen, and you go, you know what, I actually don't want to make that change. I take that back, and you just do an undo, and you could step back. So really powerful ability of doing that on the fly, actually doing some impact analysis right while you're playing in the complete compare resolve differences screen. So let's take a look at another demo. I'm going to actually exit out of this compare. And this is where I'm going to go a little off topic. I'm going to actually show you how to do something that I get this question so often, I really should have included it as part of the demo list. But I definitely want to introduce this just for the fact that this is something that people ask for all the time. What people ask for all the time is they say, I have a really, really, really large design. I have a Teradata environment, for example, and I really just want to look at this one subset of objects. I think it's databases, the subset of categories that you can filter on in Teradata. But in this case, what we're going to be looking at here is just a schema owner, right? I want to be able to look at just a subset of objects. I don't really care about these thousands and thousands of tables. I really just care about this subset of tables. How do I create an ERwin model from just those subset of the objects? So let me show you how you can do that. Step one, we're going to create a brand new blank model, logical physical. The target database is going to be the exact same database type version that your database that you're trying to target to, but it's going to be an empty model. So I'm going to create this new blank model. SQL Server 2005 in this particular case, but it can be any target database, depending on what your target system is going to be. And now actions, complete compare. And I'm going to load a model from the database. And I'm going to turn on this or leave selected this option, allow demand loading. What allow demand loading means, and this is another question I get oftentimes, but you can hit F1 and you'll get a definition. But what allow demand loading means is that it actually will only load objects as they're needed in the compare. This is going to make your complete compare much, much, much faster, and it's going to allow you to filter only on the objects you want. So let me show you an example of that. I click allow demand loading. Once again, I'm comparing a completely blank model to an actual database. I click the load button. Once again, in this case, it's going to be SQL Server 2005. Like I mentioned before, make sure the the blank model and your target database actually match. It's going to make things much simpler when you complete the complete compare. I'm going to import everything for now. We'll do our filtering at the end. And I'm going to connect to AdventureWorks, which most of you are familiar if you have a SQL Server environment. And what you see in the background here, I'm not sure if you can see this in the screen share, but you see these empty tables. These are simply placeholders for now. And you see how quickly that came back, like much, much faster than I was actually doing a full reverse engineer. For my type selection, I can use a filter if I want to. I have like a filtered complete compare option set here. Now here's where it gets interesting. On the left object selection, I actually have my existing schemas listed here. These are just the generic schemas because this is an empty model that I have opened on the left. But on the right-hand model, I actually have my, this is the actual objects that I brought from the on-demand loaded models. So what you'll notice here is I have a list of all these schemas, but I can actually say, well, let me see, I'm only interested in this person schema. And by turning on this checkbox, just like I mentioned previously, you'll see that those are the only objects that's selected from this menu. I can actually go in there and turn on a few more checkboxes if I want to, but this actually allows me to just quickly filter just on those objects. I'm not going to touch the advanced options for now. I'm just going to click the compare button. I'm not even doing any kind of really complex filtering. And then I end up in this resolve differences screen. Now, if I go to the resolve differences screen, you see that, we have this long list of changes. Once again, best practice, I collapse everything at the root level, re-expand it. I get this nice, neat subset of categories. It's much easier to read this way. So here's the AdventureWorks database. This has all the properties, physical properties for AdventureWorks. I'm actually going to import that. That cleans that up. Here's the missing domains. I'm going to import them all because, by the way, just for you, any of you out there who have never seen this before, these hash marks simply mean that the objects are missing. So given the fact that these are all missing objects, I'm not going to import them one at a time or one property at a time. I'm going to import everything at the folder level, and there you go. That all the folders disappear from the menu here itself. I have missing logins that I'm not going to import. The way to ignore differences, by the way, is to turn this mark as known difference. So you can select a specific object and mark it as a known difference, and it disappears from your list. Or I can actually select at the folder level and do it there, and that just makes that all disappear from the list as well. I also do not want to import schemas, so I'm going to mark that as a known difference. But I do want to import these changes down here, the table differences, the view differences, and the schema collection differences do matter because they are all owned by person, and you see it's all prefixed with the person. So I'm going to import those. I'm going to import my views. And I should have imported my tables first because they have missing relationships between those views and those tables. And I have missing validation rules, which I'll import. So now we're seeing more differences now that as we start adding objects, we start seeing those differences appearing at the object level, like schema, which I've actually ignored that person schema, which is okay. Most of these differences that we're seeing here is because of these properties down below, like the owner is person. So you could actually go and re-add that person schema that I filtered out before, and that will actually give you the the ability of cleaning all this up. And then once we're actually done with this, I'm actually going to click Finish here. there are known differences. This is another topic to talk about what snapshots are. I'm just going to briefly introduce them here because we don't have time. We're running out of time as it is. But snapshots actually allow you to, if you've created filters like we have on this particular dialog, you can actually save them and then have those filters available in the future. So once again, if you had templates and let's say you're always filtering out schema owner or something like that, you can actually have that snapshot saved, put it into a template file, and then everybody's using that same set of differences. I really don't care about this for this particular case, so I'm going to say no. I'm going to close out of this dialog box. And now, this is the resulting model. And if I go to my Model Explorer, I see that the only entities that were brought in were the ones that were owned by that subset of schema. And then if I want to actually see them in my model, I simply add all of them to my design, move all objects, I close, and then we can actually just lay them out and see them here. So here I've quickly, if I had just walked through it very briefly, and literally in a few seconds I could have designed this change if I wasn't talking through the whole entire process. And I can actually just quickly just see just these objects and then just their properties. So quickly having designed this, option set and with just these included physical objects, so very quickly identifying those subset. Unfortunately, I do not have time. I think we only have like a few minutes left. Do not have time to show you the merge on the model manager, but it's a similar result set, and there's no guarantee it would have actually worked anyway because I'm trying to have two users log in from the same environment. So maybe it's all for the best. But maybe it's something we'll cover if people are very interested. Maybe we'll have a follow-up conversation if we get a lot of questions, and we can actually look at that for a follow-up webinar. So I just want to kind of wrap up our presentation here. In conclusion, the compare functionality is used in several different places within ERwin, and mastering that tool will allow you, pays dividends by allowing your ERwin users to collaborate better, to make this part of your, streamline your SDLC, your process, and it kind of, it really just becomes a much faster way. If you really invest the time to getting familiar with this functionality, it's really going to make your whole entire development cycle better. So let me know. Please reach out to me, via LinkedIn. You just do if you go to LinkedIn and just do a search for Maximum Data Modeling, you'll find my group. Follow me on Twitter, or you can read my blog, maximumdatamodeling.blogspot.com, and reach out to me. Give me a call or email, and we can answer your questions if we don't have time to cover them now, and maybe suggest any kind of topic you'd like to see in the future as well. So with that, we're ready for questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Victor. Our first question, I'm not exactly sure what it pertains to. It says active subject area picks the intended subject area in both left and right models. Picking this option in CC advanced options without picking the subject area in object selection. I'm not exactly sure the question. I asked to broaden that a little bit, but I don't know if maybe you can just speak to that a little bit more.
I think someone was trying to give me some assistance on that as to what that actual property does. So it's filtering on. I believe the point was that it's filtering on the same subject area for both both sides of the option set based on the filters of the subject area. So hopefully that makes some sense to users out there. I think that the assistance was, someone was trying to help me out to give me a tech tip on that the active subject area basically automatically filters on the objects that are within that active subject area. So thanks for the pointer, and I think that is a useful piece of information for users who have an open subject area and they want to do an automatic filter both sides of the model based on that subset of objects. So that's a pretty powerful usage there. Thank you.
Okay. If indexes are not selected in type selection, will indexes be not selected in object selection?
Yes. If you filter something out in the type selection, that is the higher level of the compare. So if you've actually filtered out, whether it's stored in the type selection, that's at the metadata level. So you're actually saying, okay, I don't want to see UDPs, for example. I don't want to see any indexes. I don't want to see any tables, potentially. And that actually happens oftentimes. Like I actually have a option set where I'm doing nothing but comparing stored procedures and functions, and I actually exclude tables. If you do that at the type selection area, yes, it trickles down into the other dialogues, that you will not see any of those objects at all.
If anybody else has any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat or the Q&A. I guess in the meantime, Kevin, if you want to.
Okay, seeing that there is one new question, so go ahead, Sarah.
Are there any known issues complete comparing a model's default triggers with database triggers?
Is there a known problem with that? It depends on what version of ERwin you're on. This is actually something that's popped in and out of as a bug. But in the latest version, it works pretty well where if you filter out the comments, then those should synchronize. There is a model property, by the way, and this might be something that you're experiencing. It's a little off topic, but I do want to mention it to you because I think it might have something to do with what you're experiencing. In the fact that you can actually show at the model property itself, if you go look at the model property, you can actually turn on or turn off the option to see those ERwin-defined triggers as basically as user-defined triggers. And by doing so, you can actually see the actual trigger bodies compared to each other, like in an itemized list. What happens is the default ERwin behavior is that if it's an ERwin-defined trigger on both sides, even if the bodies are different, it'll simply say, well, this is the ERwin-defined trigger, they match, and that's all it does. But if you actually turn that option on, it'll just basically look at the actual bodies of the trigger, and then you'll get a different result set in the complete compare. So that might be what you're experiencing. But then I would basically say try it both ways and see which one gives you the best option. Once again, it's under the model properties.
Okay. And the last question we have, it says, is not related to this. They want to know about issues in keeping the column order in sync. Logical and physical models tend to lose them a lot, and it's causing issues.
What you could do, and I know people have done this in the past, you actually can use, it's not really off topic actually when you think about it from this point of view, you can actually use the complete compare to synchronize those. And what you can actually do is you can create an option set, once again, a filtered option set that does nothing but, let's say, looks at your logical logical attribute order, physical column order, or the database column order, and you can actually create an option set just with those properties in it, and then have that as a filter, do a complete compare with between your two models that you're trying to synchronize, and then apply that type selection option set only, and then all you would see was the differences in the column order. You can import them all at once, and there you go. Everything becomes much easier. But to the main point of what you're describing, ERwin actually has three option sets, and they are independent of each other. So if I create something in the logical model, that logical attribute order will propagate to the physical order and to the database order of those columns. Now, if I toggle over to the physical design and I start playing with that physical design order, it's going to be different than the attribute design. And likewise, there's yet another order, which is the column order, which would be the database order. So it's what the order of those columns would look like if you generated SQL to a database. So you wouldn't have like the primary key columns nested together, the behavior that ERwin normally shows for presentation purposes. So what you can actually do is there are, within the column properties themselves, you can also do a bulk synchronization of those properties. So that's another option too. So using the complete compare to do a report to see what's different and actually do the do the synchronization. Or simply, if you really always want them to match to the logical design, let's say, for example, you can simply go into the naming standards editor, believe it or not, it's in the naming standards editor, and you can go to column properties, and you can do a model level synchronization from there. So if that's not clear, and it probably isn't, there's actually an FAQ on the ERwin webpage. Anybody's interested, once again, reach out to me. I'll send you the link, and there is a method that will probably help you, simplify that for you. And I think that's it.
Yep, not seeing any more questions. We want to thank everybody again for attending today. We look forward to next month's session. To contact us, please, on email info@techextend.com or by phone 800-221-7710. Again, thank you to Victor, and thanks for attending. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.